for joining us today. I'm Christy Luzar. I am the Executive Director of the Urban Economic Development Association, and this is our third Emerging Topics Series session for the year. And so we're really excited to have Kevin Muse from the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, SEWRPC, here to talk about some of the updates that they've been making to Vision 2050. And in particular, they did a really extensive equity analysis. So the timing couldn't be better for this. And we are really excited to be able to provide this lunch and learn, if you will, for the folks in our network and share this information. So for those of you who may not be completely familiar, UEDA is a membership association of people and groups working in community and economic development. We have 4 main areas of work: housing and homeownership, financial services and banking access. And sorry, I just noticed, Brian, the closed captioning, okay. So yes, closed captioning is available. And then we have, we do work with small businesses, and we do a lot of capacity building and technical assistance. And programs like these are really ways for us to connect with our network and bring them together and sort of focus on topics that might be of interest, but also identify points of collaboration. So if you are not currently a member of UEDA, we encourage you to stay connected and become a member. You can do that at our website at www.uedawi.org. And you can also sign up for our mailing list too. The Emerging Topics Series is something we started a couple of years ago. For many of you who might be familiar, we used to have this annual summit, which meant once a year we'd come around together for a really great topic, but then it was once a year. And so the series actually allows us to do maybe more focused, smaller scale types of activities, but that we also are connecting with you more often. And so this is the 3rd year we've done this, and we've found it to be very successful, particularly for members in our network to be able to talk to each other and learn about new things. And this year we've gone all virtual. So like so many of us, that's how our events are happening. But we have actually found that our first 2 series sessions were very interactive and very well attended. So in terms of like actual numbers, it seems like we're actually engaging more people. So if you were able to join us for the longevity economy in June with AARP and Biz Starts, and then a few weeks ago, we actually partnered with Walnut Way and talked about African-American cooperatives and that history there. So stay tuned, this is our 3rd one. We're very excited. And then in the fall, we're looking to have a couple more sessions, we think, at least one. So I want to thank our sponsors in particular who actually have signed on to sponsor these events even before we knew they'd be virtual. So I want to thank Associated Bank, Chase, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, US Bank, and PNC Bank for their sponsorship of UEDA and this event series. It's critically important for us to be able to have that so we can do these so well and engage you all. So Kevin, first we're going to do these polls. We kind of want to see who's here today. So a couple demographic type things about age, race. So if you want to answer the poll real quickly, and Kevin, you'll be able to see how many people.
Yes. People are being pretty quick with this one, which makes sense.
Yes, we all know our age, even if we don't want to tell. It's anonymous.
All right, we're getting about 3/4 of the people have voted so far. We'll give it just a couple more seconds. Okay, looks like we've got a pretty good spread.
All right.
Let me share the results here.
Look at that.
Okay.
I'd be a little shocked if there was somebody 17 or younger watching for this.
Yeah, I would think, right. I would think so.
But that would be kind of cool.
Yeah. We'd want to find out their name and then probably hire them. So.
Right, exactly. Oh, you're really into planning and equity analysis?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So then our second here is just on race and ethnicity. So same thing. Give a few moments here.
Although they're not in school, so maybe.
That's true.
It could count for an extracurricular.
Yes, we have explored the world of virtual internships as well.
Oh, wow.
This new thing, so.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just give just a couple more seconds on this one. All right. Share the results there.
Okay.
And then one more, and then we will get to the meat of it. We just want to see if we have, I suspect people are largely from the Milwaukee County part of the region, but wanted to see if we have any from other counties as well. That'll help me
Yes.
tailor my comments a bit.
Right. And that way, you know, you're the Regional Planning Commission, so these are all the counties that are included in
Yes.
SEWRPC's footprint, if you will.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I kind of stole one of my slides here to throw it a
Oh,
little early, but that works. These are the 7 counties we serve.
yes.
So,
We won't quiz you
all
again.
right. Yeah. All right. And it looks like I suspected, largely Milwaukee County, but 1 person from Racine and 2 from Waukesha as well.
Well, great.
So that is it for the polls, I think.
Okay.
Right, Christy? Yeah.
Thank you all. You've completed your interactive portion. No, just kidding. So I'm going to introduce Kevin, but I do want to make you all know that, oh, that was terrible. Sorry. Do want to let you know that if you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to put them in the Q&A and or the chat. Nikki Payne from SEWRPC and I will both be monitoring that. So we will either wait till the end if they're more broad, or as if they're pertaining to a specific slide, we may interrupt. So feel free to do that. And if you didn't see in the chat that we are recording this and we will be sharing it. If you register directly, you will get a copy too, but we'll probably most likely put it in a newsletter, I imagine. So in the last few months, we have seen the world we live in go through some pretty dramatic changes, not just because of the pandemic, but also with the George Floyd and the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement really gaining, I think, a level of consciousness that maybe was there, but even more so now. And so racial disparities and social and economic justice issues really are at the forefront of a lot of what we are doing, particularly in our sector, but I think for a lot of people. And, you know, I can say we've been working on the HUD consolidated plan with the city. I've been immersed in this housing and demographic data for a few months now, and it just is so clear that Milwaukee really just struggles when it comes to this lack of adequate affordable housing and robust transit service. This is a long-term challenge. It's the complex issues and they're not easy solutions. And so we know a lot of you have been thinking about and working on these issues for a long time. And so one of the things about this presentation that we're really excited about is that it adds to a lot of the work that we've done with SEWRPC over many years now, particularly around the Regional Land Use and Transportation Plan, otherwise known as Vision 2050. It really sets forward an important vision that we can all work towards together in a region, and a way for us to really encourage our elected officials to utilize and invest in it. There was a great public input. A lot of what you have seen in the Vision 2050 thus far is driven by people all over the region in every county. I went to a few county sessions that I don't live there and heard a lot of the same feedback I was hearing in the community I live in. And so this is a really critical piece, and having the equity analysis gives us a new way to think about some of these challenges. So I'm pleased that we have Kevin Muse, the Executive Director for SEWRPC, with us today. SEWRPC is the regional planning agency for Southeastern Wisconsin and Metropolitan Planning, MPO. He supervises and directs the advisory regional planning efforts in transportation, land use development, and environmental resources. And prior to becoming ED, he helped lead the development of Vision 2050. So he has been living this for many years. And I can attest, after many years of working with Kevin, he really does believe strongly that the robust multimodal transportation system is needed for our region. I have also come to the same conclusion. I think is one of the most critical economic development issues we face. And so I'm hoping that some of this, and we have a lot of new leadership, particularly in our elected officials, that we can maybe see some of the changes that would better our region. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Kevin.
Well, thank you, Christy. As Christy said, Regional Planning Commission and UEDA have worked together on a number of things for a long time, and we really appreciate the partnership, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And thank you both, Jessica and Christy, for your work on this specifically as well, and for showing up to all of those public involvement sessions since, what, 2013, that have gone into the different inputs that led to Vision 2050. So I'm just gonna, there we go. Christy kind of summarized some of this already, but just wanted to emphasize a few things. So as she said, the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission is the official area-wide planning agency for the 7-county region. We in state statutes are specifically designated as advisory. So we're advisory to local units of government. The 7 counties we serve, there's 147 cities, villages, and towns in those 7 counties. And then under those state statutes that designate us as advisory, we do also advise specific state agencies related to our work. And our work can cover anything related to the physical infrastructure of the region, which might be transportation, could be sewers, could be stormwater management, those types of things. But it also covers anything related to the development of the land in the region. So where should business parks be located? Where should housing be located? What should the housing look like? What areas shouldn't we develop? What areas should be maintained as open space or agriculture or things like that? So we have a long history in the region. This is our 60th year. We were founded by the 7 counties in 1960 and have worked to serve those 7 counties in the past 60 years. So what's on the screen and was previewed by that poll, from north to south, the 7 counties we serve are the Ozaukee, Washington, Milwaukee, and Waukesha counties, making up what the census considers to be the Milwaukee area, and then also the counties between the Milwaukee area and the state line, which is Racine County, Kenosha County, and Walworth County as well. Obviously, how many of those counties you include in the greater Milwaukee area really depends on what you're looking at. Certainly by medium market, it's even larger than this. So those 7 counties make up about 5% of the state's land area, but more than a third, so 30 to 35% of the region's people, jobs, and wealth. So we really, or of the state's, sorry, people's jobs and wealth. So it's really a highly urbanized area and is a substantial driver for the economy of the state of Wisconsin as well. Christy mentioned that I'm going to be talking quite a bit about Vision 2050, which is the Regional Planning Commission's long-range plan for land use and transportation going out to the year 2050. Vision 2050 was first developed and completed in 2016, although many of you may have been involved in the public involvement process that led to Vision 2050, which really initiated in 2013, 2014, and went through spring of 2016. So pretty extensive, long-running process. We are required, in addition to being the Regional Planning Commission, which is a state designation, we are the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a federal transportation designation. And those guidelines around being a metropolitan planning organization require that we do an update to this type of long-range plan every 4 years. So we actually just completed the first update to Vision 2050 in June of this year, in June 2020. So I'll be talking about that updated version of the plan today. As we did Vision 2050 and as we prepared the update, one of the first things we did was we looked at how Southeastern Wisconsin, and in particular Metro Milwaukee, compared to peer metropolitan areas across the country. So this is comparing Metro Milwaukee to 14 metro areas that are our size or larger within 500 miles, so largely the Midwest. And that we did include larger metro areas in the Midwest like Chicago, the Twin Cities, Detroit, in addition to ones that are more closely similar in size to the Milwaukee metro area. And then we also included another 14, so 28 peers in total, outside of that 500-mile radius. And those are all roughly around the 2 million, plus or minus a few 100,000 people, around the 2 million mark, similar to the Milwaukee metro area. So when we compared across a whole bunch of statistics to our peer metro areas, we found a number of things, but 3 things that really stuck out for us. As many of you who have lived in this area for really any substantial amount of time probably know, it's a relatively slow growth metro area. So our population and job growth have been relatively slow for about 30 years or so in our metro area, and certainly in the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen slower population and job growth than many of our peers. Not all, but many. And then this is a story that gets repeated with regularity because we unfortunately have not made much progress in these, at least since the time I've been even tangentially involved in these issues, which is that our metro area has substantial racial disparities. And those are, we are the worst or among the worst in those peers when it comes to educational attainment along racial lines, income, poverty status, those types of things. It's really just a pretty dramatic disparity between the people of color in the region, and particularly the Black and African American population in the region compared to whites or everyone else. So white non-Hispanic is what it's compared against if you're looking at the census data categories. So that's really a story. I think there was just another study that Alum helped sponsor from UWM that really emphasized this and really dove even deeper than we did into these disparities, and found much the same that we did there. So it's really kind of a constant drumbeat of the challenge of our metro area to be more equitable. And then something else we found specifically related to the Commission's work is that we have a relatively unbalanced transportation system compared to peer metro areas. We have relatively low levels of congestion. We certainly have some congestion in our metro area, but it is not at the scale that many of our peers experience. And then compared to our peers, we do have a relatively reasonable amount of transit. But there are two key differences, and one of which I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail as we get on, but we haven't been heading in the right direction compared to our peers. We're not investing in transit the way our peers have been. And we also have relatively slow existing service because we haven't been investing in express or rapid service. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So just some more concrete data behind each of these 3 points that I just summarized. So as I said, relatively slow population and job growth. You can see these data are between 2010 and 2018. On the left is population growth, and on the right is change in employment. And so this is just the Midwest peers, but we are right in the middle, but we would be towards the bottom if you looked outside the Midwest in population growth, percent change. So we are growing, but quite slowly as a metro area. And then job growth, which again is a much more robust level between 2010 and 2018, which is why pre-COVID our unemployment rate was quite low across the region. However, still slow job growth, even given that compared to those peer metro areas. Diving a little bit deeper into those significant racial disparities, on the right there is what's called a dot map. This, in this case, showing race and ethnicity. Green dots represent individuals who are white alone, non-Hispanic, and then blue is Black. Kind of a purplish color is Asian or Pacific Islander. And then actually there's also more than one race basically, or some other races is represented by kind of a brown color, and then an orange is Hispanic ethnicity. So you can really see a familiar story, I think, for anyone who's followed these issues in the region. Pretty stark lines regarding where people live in the region by race or ethnicity. And perhaps even more concerning than that is the disparities in the things I'm talking that are on the left hand of the slide, which is that about 4.5 people of color are about 4.5 times less likely than whites in the metro area to have a high school diploma. They're about 2 times less likely than whites to have a bachelor's degree, and slightly over 4 times more likely than whites to have incomes at or below the federal poverty level. And as I said earlier, racial disparities in the Milwaukee metro area are more pronounced than almost all other US metro areas when you look at these statistics and others. And then diving a little bit further into that unbalanced transportation system. As I talked about, we're relatively low in levels of highway congestion and travel delay, although our amount of delay experienced by the average driver did grow quite substantially over the past decade. about as quickly as most of our peer areas, is about the median of our peers, which is unusual. Historically, our level of congestion has grown less quickly than most peers. But we are the highest in transit service decline between 2000 and now. We've lost more than 25% of our transit service across the region since the year 2000, while almost all of our peers have increased and invested in transit service over that time period. I think the average of all the peers is an increase of about 11%, but that really hides the standout cities like Salt Lake City or Denver, Portland, and others who have really made substantial, Twin Cities is another one, really made substantial investments in increasing the amount of transit service they provide over the past 15 to 20 years. And then I talked a little bit about our transit system being relatively slow. I do want to be clear here, this isn't actually a criticism of MCTS or any of the other transit operators in our region. What it reflects is that we haven't had the resources to really make the capital investments, which is an industry term for basically the physical infrastructure investments that allow rapid transit. And by rapid transit, I mean, could be train, could be bus, but it means something that has its own dedicated right-of-way, so it's not in the lane with mixed traffic. It often has substantial stations so that they're spaced further apart and they offer more amenities for passengers than just a bus stop or shelter does. And also there's other things you can do depending on the right-of-way to give the transit corridor more priority so that the train or the bus is not sitting at red lights and things like that. So we're one of the few metro areas in the country of our size that does not have rapid transit. Milwaukee County is working on that right now via presidential tweet recently. We found out that the county would be receiving about $40 million in Federal Transit Administration dollars to connect downtown Milwaukee to the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center. And a portion of that route will have dedicated lanes, and all of it will have the other features I mentioned around the more advanced and substantial stations and the traffic signal improvements. So that's really a great step in the right direction. And we applaud Milwaukee County for making that investment, especially in some dire financial times. But there's more that needs to be done like that. So as I said, that was something that we did as a review before we started the original Vision 2050 planning process and before we started the update. And we used that to help determine what we wanted to recommend, in addition to public involvement, of course, and public input, what we wanted to recommend for the region's future land use and transportation systems. So what is Vision 2050? It's the region's long-range land use and transportation plan. It makes those advisory recommendations to local and state government regarding what we think the region's land use and transportation system should look like. We did have a number of extensive public involvement opportunities as part of developing the plan. There were more than 82 workshops across the region and quite a few people, more than 1,600 unique individuals attended one or more of these workshops, and a number of individuals came back for more than one because it was at various stages in the process. And there were a lot of other ways that people provided input as well. You know, 1,600 people out of a region of 2 million residents isn't a huge success, but it is leaps and bounds better than what we previously achieved. So we're both proud of that and also aware of the limitations of traditional public involvement when it comes to those sorts of things. So we also did other inputs like a statistically significant survey of the region's residents, and also tried to focus on making sure that that individuals who may have not had a great opportunity to be involved in the past, from communities of color or low-income members of the region or people with disabilities, that we really focused on reaching out to them and making sure that they did have good opportunities and they were able to provide input. And we did that through partners with a number of community organizations, and UEDA was one of those partners during the plan development process. So what was the result of that? What did the plan recommend? There's and I want to, I guess before you get into these recommendations, I want to mention, and I'll talk in more detail about this at the end of the presentation, not the end, but really the next half of the presentation, which is our equity analysis piece. I already talked about the disparities that we saw, and all of us, I think many of us know about when it comes to the region along racial lines. And those disparities also exist along income and other categories as well. We use that to impact and change the recommendations along with that public input, and modify them from where they were historically in previous generations of the regional land use and transportation plan. And so some of these are very consistent, but some of these really tried to do what we could in our part, in our, what's in the state statutes, what we can touch, land use development and physical infrastructure, to hopefully address some of the equity issues that the region sees. And so the plan recommends focusing urban development in urban centers as best we can. So there are lots of parts of our region that have seen divestment over the past 30, 40 years. And those areas are really an opportunity for new growth, new investment, and new economic activity. And we really want to do what we can to support that and focus the development in the region in those centers. We want to increase and recommend increased density across the region. It's more efficient from a municipal finance perspective. It's easier to provide public services in denser areas, and cheaper per person and per household to do that. And it also provides more economic vitality. I'm getting a little into the economic weeds here, but there's a concept called agglomeration, which basically is a way of trying to capture the economic growth that occurs from concentrating more humans in one area. And there are benefits to that from an economic growth perspective. And then it's also talking about preserving primary environmental corridors, preserving that open space and our prime agricultural land across the region. I did want to talk a little bit about the mix of housing types and uses. Something that is probably worth emphasizing is that the region has a pretty substantial shortage of affordable housing. And what we mean by affordable housing doesn't necessarily mean subsidized affordable housing. It means housing that someone can afford by spending less than 30% of their income on housing related costs each month. And so we had done, previous to this planning effort, a pretty substantial regional housing plan focused just on this issue. And we found that we are only providing about a third of the subsidized affordable housing that we would like to be able to provide in the region based on the incomes of the residents of the region. So we've got a substantial shortage there. But even beyond subsidized affordable housing, we're no longer building a lot of the types of housing units at market rate that are affordable to a cross-section of the region's population. Essentially, too many of the homes in the region are being built on lots that are too large, or are the homes themselves may be physically too large to allow for someone of modest means to be able to afford those homes in those areas. So it really creates a challenge when you have jobs moving to more suburban parts of the region, but you don't necessarily have the variety of housing types you need in those areas at the same time. So this is what that recommended land use development pattern looks like. I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on this other than to note that purple is the densest, and as you get closer to yellow, that's the least dense. And we're really trying to focus that development in the top three categories. We call them mixed use city center, mixed use traditional neighborhood, and small lot traditional neighborhood. I'll just mention something briefly about the cut lines. So we recommend those three categories most strongly. And those three categories are essentially most people in those areas living on a quarter-acre lot or smaller. And so, and it certainly include apartments, condos, multifamily developments as well in all three of those categories. So that's really where we focus our recommendations for housing and development in the region. Just to note, the green on the map, those are environmental corridors that I spoke about. Obviously, we've from the early polling, we know that there's a strong number of people from Milwaukee County. A large percentage of the people listening are from Milwaukee County. There is fewer environmental corridors in Milwaukee County, largely because by the time we started calling something an environmental corridor in the 70s, a lot of those in Milwaukee County had already been developed. But they typically follow the rivers, and you can see the green ribbons if you look closely at Milwaukee County on the map, following the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnick and other rivers in the county. We also make some recommendations for bicycle and pedestrian improvements across the region. I didn't talk about these yet, but this is one of the transportation modes that we cover in the plan. We're really trying to focus on improving the sidewalk situation in the region. There are a number of areas where either the sidewalks are in rough shape, or they aren't properly accessible, or there aren't any sidewalks. And so anywhere there's urban development, we really recommend that there be accessible sidewalks as much as possible. We also have recommendations around expanding the off-street path in the region. We have a pretty robust off-street path network in southeastern Wisconsin for walking and biking, but there are some pretty obvious gaps that I think anybody who tries to bike in southeastern Wisconsin is well aware of. Gaps between the Oak Leaf Trail and the Hank Aaron, for instance. And so those sorts of gaps should really be filled in. And there's some specific areas where we think trails make sense where we don't have them today as well, including, for instance, along the 30th Street Industrial Corridor on the north side of Milwaukee. The Century City area should have a path along that rail corridor. And then also substantial improvements to the on-street bike network, including things that the city of Milwaukee has started to implement called enhanced bicycle facilities in our parlance, but basically anything that provides some physical barrier between moving vehicles and the bike lane. So it's more than just paint protecting the bikes from moving vehicles. All of these improvements, well, all the on-street improvements as well as the sidewalk improvements can also, if done well, discourage speeding and reckless driving. So that's another reason to consider these improvements. So just a brief map here. Again, I won't spend too much time expecting you to stare very closely at the screen, but red are those corridors where we recommend those physical separation between bikes and moving vehicles and traffic. And then green is the off-street path network as well. On that map. And those red corridors are not the only place those corridors that are physically separated can go in the region. It's just where we identified there's a lot of regional travel by people on bike or foot, and therefore those corridors would be most beneficial there. So one of the things, and this really gets to the crux of, well, why isn't this happening? One of the things that we're required to do as the Metropolitan Planning Organization under federal guidelines is determine not only what we would like to see, but what we can afford given our current revenue streams. And so I'm about to talk a little bit about both the public transit and the streets and highways elements of Vision 2050. Those two elements, the amount of money that would be required, this is millions of dollars every year in 2019 dollars to implement our recommendations is what's shown on the top half of the screen. So it's about $485 million per year for public transit and about $950 million per year for streets and highways. You can compare that to the funding available on the bottom half of the screen. So this is what our current taxing structure is expected to generate each year between now and 2050, and our current fee structure as well. It's not just taxes that go into this. So we've got about a $250 million gap for public transit and a almost $400 million gap for streets and highways between now and 2050 compared to the recommendations in the regional plan. I do want to note for the streets and highways piece, that is not, $400 million a year is not just for capacity expansion. So we often have pretty dramatic debates in the region about whether or not to add lanes to mostly freeways. And there's of course a cost to that, but it's only about 10 to 15% of the cost of that project, which this is all of the arterial streets and highways in the region. So not even just specific to that project. So that $400 million gap, if we don't find a way to increase the revenue, that means we have continued decline in the quality of the streets and highways in the region from a surface quality perspective. So more potholes, less safe roads, those sorts of things. So capacity expansion is part of this conversation, but it is not what's driving that gap in funding. So what do we recommend for public transit? And I'm actually going to flip to the map here just to give you a little more time to look at this. So what we recommend in public transit is implementing that rapid transit that I talked about earlier. So bus or train that has dedicated lanes or dedicated track that doesn't have to fight with automobiles, can have its own path and really move much more quickly. The idea behind the recommended transit system, and those are the purple lines on the map, by the way. So largely in Milwaukee County with one corridor heading west into downtown Waukesha. The idea behind those rapid transit lines and the orange commuter rail lines, also shown on the map, is to speed up the transit system so that it is more competitive compared to driving. So that people, by choice, may be riding transit across the region, and to really build a fast grid, particularly in Milwaukee County, of these transit lines so it's easy to get around and get from A to B. The other main focus of our transit recommendations are increasing the areas you can get to with the transit system. And in particular here, we're trying to focus on those business parks where those jobs are, in the areas just both within and just outside of Milwaukee County, where right now, if you don't have a car, you cannot access those jobs. And so this could mean running bus routes there, but it can also mean running flexible shuttles and vans and things like that to those business parks as part of expanding the transit network as recommended. So I talked a little bit about that funding gap, and the result of that funding gap is this is what we want, about $485 million a year to get there cost-wise. This is what we think we will end up with in 2050 if we don't do something different. And this is actually worse than what the map shows, because not only is there less areas receiving service than today, service will become a lot less frequent between now and 2050 if we don't do something different. So we don't even, let alone the expansion we're recommending, we don't have the money with our current revenue streams to fund our existing system. As we've seen the declines in transit service over the past 15, 20 years, those same declines are expected to continue. We'd expect to lose another third of our transit system by the year 2050 if we don't do something different on the funding side of things. And why does that matter? So one of the main ways I look at this, and I consider this, and this is very much from the equity framework and perspective, is access to opportunity. If you want people to be able to improve themselves, make more money, support their families, live a more fiscally sustainable life, they need access to jobs. And so what's shown here is the number of jobs you can get to from any location in the region within 30 minutes via transit. So the darkest red, which is only under Vision 2050, is 200,000 or more jobs within 30 minutes from those locations. But it varies from that to just over 1,000 by that kind of lightest, almost blue-gray color. So on the left is what is today. That's what how many jobs you can access via transit in 30 minutes today. And really you can see this. This really reflects, in addition to the transit service, it also reflects where the jobs are. And so you can see that darkest red and orange is around downtown Milwaukee, where there are about 90,000 jobs. In the middle is what that access would look like if Vision 2050 was implemented. And you can see substantial improvement along throughout many parts of the region. The commuter rail lines really stand out here just because they're so much faster. So that's City of Racine, Kenosha, and parts of Waukesha County has some substantial improvements because of those. But Milwaukee County too, throughout the county, and particularly on the near south side and on the north side, huge improvements in job accessibility via transit under Vision 2050. On the right is what we think 2050 will look like if we don't do something different about our financial situation. And so that's obviously worse than today, and that that dark line east-west, that is the east-west bus rapid transit route that Milwaukee County is investing in. And that's really the only bright spot in this compared to today. So streets and highways, I just wanted to touch on this one pretty briefly here. Essentially, the concept behind the plan under streets and highways is to restore streets to a state of good repair, reduce potholes, improve striping, make things safer by doing curb bump outs and things that shorten the crossing distance for pedestrians and improve the situation for cyclists as well, people on bikes as well. And then there is also some capacity expansion, about 8% increase in the number of lane miles in the region. And that is largely in those blue lines on this map. Those are the streets and highways that are recommended for additional 1 lane in each direction under the regional plan. And then red are the brand new roads, and there are frankly very few brand new roads recommended in the region under this plan, other than a few that have been in the plan for a very long time and are strongly desired by their local communities. So relatively modest, I think anyways, relatively modest improvements in capacity, with really a focus on state of good repair and trying to keep our streets and highways in better shape than they are today. Same thing, a gap here means that we won't see nearly as many of those improvements between now and 2050 unless we do something different on the funding side of our streets and highway system. So we do talk a little bit in the plan about ways we could address that funding gap. I don't want to spend too much time on these other than to note that many peer regions across the country, those peer metro areas, we did look at how they fund their transportation systems, and focusing in on transit, many of them do use a dedicated sales tax. Some use dedicated income or property taxes as well, and that's an option too. And that dedicated sales tax generally varies between about a ½ cent and a little over 1%. And if we had a ½ cent to 1%, we could get most of what is recommended in the plan built. The commuter rail lines, the rapid transit, the improvement in access to suburban business parks, all of that could happen with a robust sales tax dedicated to transit. There are other options as well that are shown here on the slide. So equity analyses are something that you are required to do, and we are required to do as the Metropolitan Planning Organization. But I will brag a little bit and say that I think ours is among the best in the country. And really what you seek to do with that is look at if the benefits and impacts of the plan are shared fairly and equitably, and does the plan serve to reduce significant long-standing disparities between white residents and people of color in your region. And so looking at those population groups, I showed this map before, there are kind of 3 different categories that we focus on. One is communities of color, another is families in poverty in the region, and then the third is people with disabilities. There obviously can be crossover between these categories, but we do look at them separately in addition to combined. And what our findings are, and this is really the reason that that job access, that the 3-map slide I talked about is so important, is that the percent of people in the region with no vehicle available really does change depending on the color of your skin or your income status. And so about 16% of the minority households in the region do not have a car, compared to 6% of non-minority households. It, unsurprisingly, is even more of a dramatic disparity for families in poverty. Almost 1/3 of the residents in poverty in the region do not have access to a car. So if you care about helping those people get out of poverty, having an alternative where they can get where they need to go and access jobs and opportunities and education and socialization and medical and health services and all those things, it matters. And that's why we think that this is such an important equity issue in the region, to invest in better housing options across the region and invest in transit in the region. About 4 times as many people of color or families in poverty or people with disabilities would have access to high quality transit under Vision 2050 than if we follow our current path to the year 2050 without additional resources. Another way to look at this is how many jobs these different population groups can access, or what percentage of these population groups has access to quite a few jobs, 10,000 or more jobs within 30 minutes by transit. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know it's tough to stare at charts when you're looking at a presentation, but what I want to note is orange is the access today. So taking a look just at the top category, so almost 60%, over 55% of the community of the households led by a person of color in the region today have access to 10,000 or more jobs within 30 minutes by transit. Under Vision 2050, you can see that grow towards 90% under the recommended plan. But if we don't do something on the funding side of things, and we don't do something on thinking equitably about how we provide services in this region, it's expected to get worse. And that's what's shown in gray is 2050 without a different funding mechanism for transit. It falls to more like 30%, 30 to 35% of the households, in minority-led households in the region have access to 10,000 or more jobs within 30 minutes by transit. So that to me is really kind of the summation of what we're talking about here, at least on the transportation side of things. It's access to opportunity, and it's the struggle of how do you provide those opportunities and that access in a more equitable way across the region. We found that if we head down, and this chart tells that tale, if we head down the current path and don't implement the recommendations of the regional plan, the future of the region does not get better from an equity perspective. This is, of course, not the only issue going on, as Christy mentioned, following George Floyd's murder and the ensuing increase in the Black Lives Matter movement and the broadening, I think, of the coalition behind the Black Lives Matter movement. There's plenty of other things that the Regional Planning Commission doesn't directly address that are absolutely valid concerns within that movement. But the things we do touch around housing and around transit, if we don't do something different than what we're doing today, we're not going to see improvement in those results. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions anyone might have.
All right, and I was going to say, if people would like to pose their questions in Q&A or chat, I think because we're in a webinar, you're muted automatically. This is where I'm not as good as Jessica at facilitating these things.
Sure. I don't see anybody who did a Q&A, but I do think they're, let's see, here's the chat.
Yeah. I will say thanks for Jeff for putting the information about ridemcts.com, and that should be a /next, but I know that you guys had the community surveys out. We were sharing those too, I think it was last winter, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
But great opportunity for people to contact their board of supervisors, and also just to have that on the radar, because it really is about improving our transit system. And I don't know, I guess I have a question, Kevin. When you guys were completing the equity analysis, knowing that you look at the data a lot, right? And so,
Yeah.
and obviously even the spatial segregation is something that we're all very keenly aware of, but like as you looked at it from the frame and Vision 2050 and the equity analysis, was there something in particular that like stuck out to you, or like that you felt like reframed a little bit of how you normally think about all of this?
Well, I think there's kind of a couple things that really stuck out to me. So one was just how far behind we are.
Yeah.
And I know we all kind of know that, but then you look at the data and you see that the outcomes are just so terrible along racial lines in our metro area. And so I think that makes, just lights a fire under, I think, us, and with our role, we can't be too strong of advocates, but put a frame into the plan. And then I think for me, when it comes to the actual difference in the plan, what we're recommending versus where we're headed, I really think this slide does sum it up. I know charts are not that exciting, but just the huge disparity between what we want to happen for access to opportunity in the region versus where we're headed if we don't do something different. It's just such a striking difference in access along those lines, either via poverty or communities of color status. So.
Right. I think for me too, it's hard sometimes when I look at this data again and I think about it, it's hard for me not to feel a little downtrodden because
Sure.
like, why don't people understand, particularly people who can, you know, put forward legislation or approve money. It's just it's a very politicized issue in our region, unfortunately, and Brian had alluded to that in his comments too. So I think we have one question I'm going to go to that takes us more to housing, and then we'll come back to another one. Are there specific recommendations for diversifying housing in the first ring suburbs? Like how does that get communicated or incorporated into local zoning codes?
Sure, yeah. So first ring suburbs specifically is actually a bit of a complex answer because a lot of the first ring suburbs do have planning staff full-time as part of their city or village staff. And so we work with them essentially on request. They're very much aware of the regional housing plan and very much aware of its recommendations. And we do, and we have in the past taken a look at their existing codes and in particular their comp plans and what they're seeking. This is not universally true. I would say a number of the larger first ring suburbs, there's more of a disconnect between what developers are approaching them with as far as what the developers think they can build and still make money and not lose their shirts compared to what would be affordable to some of our lower income populations in the region. So I think there's that challenge, and I think Ursula, who asked that, is probably very aware of that challenge. If there's things specifically related to zoning that you're interested in, I think we could talk about that and try to figure out where the Regional Planning Commission could assist. I'm just going to answer Ursula's second question here. I think it's a follow-up. So we started the regional housing plan, and I can personally give my opinion on that. The commission itself has not taken that sort of position. What we do have recommended in the regional housing plan is that no community, we recommend every community have at least a substantial area where multifamily housing is allowed. So it's not that single family housing is, or zoning is banned everywhere. It was more the path of let's start with those communities that are entirely single family zoned and work towards having areas in those communities where workforce housing could exist. We haven't come back to that recommendation since eliminating single family zoning has become more popular, or I shouldn't say, it's not really popular, but it's become a bit of a movement within the urban circles across the country. And so I can't speak to whether the commission would have an opinion on that because I haven't asked them.
Okay. So I'm going to go back up to another question is like, what is the main reason you think support for addressing these inequities has lagged?
Oh boy. I think that when it comes to transit in particular in the region, we seem to have developed a very strange and fairly unique perspective that transit is almost entirely a social service. And that is not typically how transit is looked at across the country and other metro areas of our size. For instance, two fairly conservative metro areas, Salt Lake City and Indianapolis, or at least metro areas within fairly conservative states that I would say are even more conservative than Wisconsin. There are conservatives and members of the GOP in those areas that are pretty strong supporters of transit investment from an economic development perspective and from an access to opportunity perspective. I think I would like to say, I don't want to put words into their mouths, but I think because they recognize that if you truly think people shouldn't be on subsidies, as many conservatives do, for various things related to income, you have to give people opportunities to actually get to jobs. And so I think there is a conservative case to be made for that investment from that perspective. Unfortunately, in Wisconsin, I personally haven't seen that kind of cross-party understanding and investment in the value of this sort of service transit investment from the perspective of economic development and really making the region work better for the workforce and for the businesses in the region.
Right. It's difficult because, I mean, we've been part of coalitions that have been multi-factional, if you will, with business and nonprofits and community-based organizations and individuals. And it still seems like we couldn't get as far because there is this disconnect for some people from an ideological standpoint. But I mean, it's like you ride a bus, you see it's people going to work and school every day. Like, it's not a social service, it's a critical part of our infrastructure. So I'm going to hand it off to Nikki, we have a couple questions in Q&A.
Yes, one of them being, what is the connection to Milwaukee's successes?
Is that?
And we may need a little more description from that.
Yeah.
Her prior question is, how will Vision 2050 connect with decision makers and leaders?
Sure. Yeah, I can tackle that. So there's decision makers and leaders. It kind of depends on what level, but we do work with county governments in the region, and we work with cities, villages, and towns in the region to implement what they're able to. Frankly, the scale of our recommendations are so large that it really requires state action. And so we have met with members of the legislature to brief them on Vision 2050 more than once. And generally speaking, it gets favorable reviews. You know, different individuals have different things they like in the plan, but that hasn't necessarily led to movement in the Capitol on the issues. And I will say we are limited in the level and amount of advocacy we can do as an agency just within the state statutes. So we can provide these advisory recommendations, and I, as a member of the staff, can go out and talk to anyone, including elected officials, about our recommendations, but we can't lobby the legislature, and we cannot even advocate in the way that maybe a 501c3 could advocate at the legislative level, which is why we rely on working with groups like UEDA and that coalition that Christy mentioned earlier to build support across a broad swath of groups, and we can assist them with data and with this vision and kind of a comprehensive understanding of the issues. So.
Which was also part of another question was, which you've answered, have you ever put together a plan for advocates to coordinate? But if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing across the country, that would be helpful too.
Sure. So what we have seen across the country, and it's kind of two different advocacy approaches, both of which seem to be seeing some success. So Atlanta and Cincinnati recently have had very grassroots oriented advocacy coalitions that have come together, largely around almost small steps, starting with small steps and getting to big steps. So talking about just very basic, consistent with MCTS Next, which I think was mentioned in the chat by Jeff, that we need to make this route faster. How do we do little things along the corridor to make this route faster so people can get to jobs faster, or get to work, or get to jobs or get to school or something like that faster. And then they build that into essentially a series of relationships with elected officials, and where they have more and more influence. And Cincinnati has seen some really great success with that, and so has Atlanta. Kind of the flip side, I think, would be more consistent with the approach that we were trying to take, or that the region, because I wasn't actually here at that time, but the region was trying to take back in 2006, 7, 8, 9. And that was more of a business and large institutional and civic organization approach. Indianapolis did have success with that. It was actually led by their statewide Chamber of Commerce. Their head lobbyist of the Chamber of Commerce was a big advocate for transit, and he helped organize and put together a coalition that coordinated different groups to make the pitch to the state capitol in Indiana. And they actually got, of all things, not a sales tax, an income tax dedicated to transit, which I personally was surprised, given the makeup of the Indiana legislature, that that's the way they went, but that is what they wanted to do. So that's what Indianapolis now has, is a dedicated income tax for transit. Yeah, so that would be another approach for success as well.
Okay. So one of the other questions in the chat was about how this data helps us, given the loss of jobs that we're currently seeing in city and suburbs due to the pandemic and economic decline. So we have a lot of layoffs, job loss, and bankruptcies, and obviously the recovery is uneven. We don't know what it's really going to look like. And so how can we know where jobs and transit will need to coexist?
Sure. Well, I don't have an answer to that. You know, I think we do not have a crystal ball on that one. I think what we are hoping for from a planning perspective is a recognition that maybe we didn't do as good of a job as we could have following the last recession, and making sure that you know, there's pain associated with the recession no matter what, but making sure that that pain isn't disproportionate, and then also making sure that the rebound, which I certainly hope eventually will happen, I think of course it will in some form, that the rebound is also shared more equitably and distributed better. We saw in Southeastern Wisconsin and in Milwaukee in particular that actually a lot of our inequities got substantially worse
Right.
following the last recession. And so, you know, there are work groups, Christy is leading one of them, trying to make sure that doesn't happen again this time as best we can.
Yeah.
I'm getting a little off script here, but I will say that there are things we can do on the nonprofit sector side that I think can result in better results, better outcomes to address that. I do think that we are just so starved for resources right now when it comes to the government sector in Southeastern Wisconsin that it is a challenge to see how the government's going to be able to lead on that issue the way our current structures are set up. So.
Right. I feel like for a lot of these things, it's hard to have these kinds of conversations when everyone feels like you're starting from a point of scarcity.
Yeah.
Particularly from the state and local level. That is a huge challenge given what's happening right now. Let's see, we're just after 1 o'clock. I think we've answered most of them. When I saw Bethany had actually talked about, given the recommendations that goes to jurisdictions, like what are the best ways to follow up or urge and nudge them? I will say we don't have to answer that today, but I was thinking, looking at Gary Goike's question too, is UEDA, one of the things we are really hoping to get accomplished by the end of the year is to form an advocacy and policy committee as part of our structure of board and membership committees. So if you are interested in being a part of that, part of it is capacity, but we're working on that to try to get a few other projects done, but this fall. And one of the first things is we have some initial work done around that, but you know, I feel like transportation is such a critical issue for so much of the work that we see happening in our sector. And so I feel like that might be one place where we could work together. So please reach out to me if you are interested, and it might take us a month or two, but we're not forgetting about that. And key allies for the plan in the legislature, that's something we can talk about too. There are, and then there aren't. There are also key opponents, so, sadly.
Indeed.
So I want to thank you all for joining us for this third series, and really thank you to Kevin and Nikki for helping us get this together so quickly. It was a great opportunity to revisit Vision 2050 and think about the vision that we see in our region, what we'd like it to look like in so many different ways, both from a housing and how we move around and the kinds of accessibility that we have for environmental spaces and green places and transportation and getting to work and all of that good stuff. So thank you for joining us for the Lunch and Learn. Stay connected to UEDA if you are not already. We are planning sessions for fall. Also our annual community gathering, normally a happy hour type thing. We are thinking about what to do for that. So most likely virtual, stay tuned. And I also just want to briefly mention, there is an event that came in my inbox that you might find of interest. AARP Wisconsin shared it. They are having a national virtual conference gathering with the AARP Livable Communities. It's a transportation workshop. It's September 15th through the 16th. And it is free. So there are 3 core transportation themes: safety, accessibility, and resilience. And the workshop will share and talk all about that. Livable Communities is just a really fascinating, we're actually considering doing an emerging topics on that as well. I will put the link in the chat, but we will also share that in our follow-up email and in our newsletter. So, oh boy, that's long. Clearly I got that, but feel free to click it now. But it's something that for a lot of you, if you joined us today, you might find it of interest. And so I think, is there anything else, Kevin or Nikki, that you want to do?
No, I don't think so. I would just say, feel free to get a hold of me if you have other questions or things you want to talk about related to this. Our website is SEWRPC.org, and you can contact us there, and it will go straight to either my or Nikki's email, and we can further the conversation if you're interested. So.
Right, and I know in the promotion links, we sent out a link directly to the equity analysis. So in our
Perfect.
follow-up, I'll tell Jessica to make sure to include that again. So you have an easy way to access that if you need it. But you can also go to the Vision 2050 website too.
Yep.
So,
Thank you for
everyone.
the opportunity. Yep.
Have a good day. All right. Okay, so Kevin, I don't know how we do this now. Since you're the host, you can hand it back over to me if you'd like. Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.